Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast here with host Jimmy Hinton and
Jimmy's lovely mom, Clara.
You know, I said just this week, actually just today, I was on the phone with somebody and I was telling them about the podcast here, and it's just a little bit of insight. I have a tendency to just get busy, and, you know, I try to, not try, sometimes things go to the wayside, we'll put it that way. And it's hard to prioritize sometimes, but this podcast, my mother
Come on,
pushes,
Jim.
she pushes me to get this podcast out every week. And so I was telling this person that were it not for my mom being my mom, that this podcast would probably happen once a month or, you know, once every 6 months.
No.
But she is like the steady Susan.
Thank you.
So,
right.
So you owe it, all of you listeners owe it to Clara Hinton for
Jimmy's
maintaining
mom,
for my mommy for really being dedicated
That's
to this
my
podcast.
job.
I know, and
That's
you're good
my
at
job.
it.
There you
so
go.
I'm proud of you.
Okay.
I'm very proud of you.
All right. Thank you for that.
You're consistent, you're dedicated, you're committed, and that's pretty awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm giving credit where credit is due.
Ooh, I feel good.
Don't let it go to your head.
I know.
So we wanted to talk this week about the publishing of the Houston Chronicle series on abuse in the Southern Baptist Church. That's a pretty hot topic. Obviously, that's generated a lot of discussion, not just nationwide, but I think worldwide.
Right, and rightly so.
Yeah. So, you know, several of our friends were in the report. So it just shows that it's a small world. Abuse affects so many people. And, you know, this is just another one of those tragic stories where many people within the Southern Baptist churches, which I'll explain this a little bit because the churches of Christ that I preach in are structured pretty similarly. So our congregations, the SBC congregations they're autonomous. So each local congregation is responsible for ordaining and hiring and firing their own ministers.
Right.
So there is
I was going to say, make sure.
Yeah, there's no governing body that does the hiring. Yeah, that oversees the hiring and firing. So that's up to each individual church. There are benefits to autonomous churches. So I actually like that we're part of autonomous churches for a couple reasons. And one is it gives you flexibility where you answer to your local leadership, your local elders and deacons and within your own congregation. That works well if you build accountability into that congregation. Our congregation is really good at accountability. In fact, my elders and I just had this conversation on Monday, and one of my elders looked at me and he said, "If I'm ever doing anything that would hurt somebody, that would cause their faith to really suffer, please remove me from being an elder."
That statement, Jimmy, is probably not heard very often at all. That is a very unique and a very beautiful statement.
Yeah.
Sincere. beautiful from the heart. But
well, and he meant it too.
Well,
and there's a difference.
Saying.
There's a difference between saying that and and not meaning it. But he really meant it.
Yes.
And so my response was, "You're fired." No, I'm just kidding. No, my response was, first of all, I thanked him for saying that because he really meant it. And I said the other thing is, we have accountability built in where. We're not treated differently. Like, I don't know how to explain this well. We don't get special preference. So I don't get any special preference from my elders whatsoever, or congregation.
I know what you're saying.
They don't treat me any differently than any other member of the congregation, and they shouldn't.
Within the churches of Christ, in particular, of which you're obviously we are affiliated part of, you don't wear robes of distinction. You don't wear collars of distinction.
No,
you don't carry any kind of a saber.
Well, we don't do ordinations either, and so in the Church of Christ, like I have an MDiv, so I have Master of Divinity, which most people who go into ministry who are ordained, they get an MDiv, but then they have to go through an ordination process as well. And it's sometimes a pretty lengthy process. We don't do ordinations. And again, everything has benefits and downsides, but all that to say, the independent churches, the autonomous churches are typically elder-led, or an elder governed, which ours isn't. And it probably would be if I didn't grill it into the congregation so much and just preach from scripture and show that that's not a biblical model.
Right. Okay.
So, we work together as a team. There is no positioning over. So my elders are not over me. And the deacons are not under us. We're all
working
equal.
Together.
We work together.
As part of the family.
Right.
Okay.
So we have a team, and within that team, we have accountability built in, even with our board of directors. So we're incorporated, and even our board of directors has accountability where if there is kind of this nepotism and, these weird things going on within the leadership, the board can step in and they can remove us. Now, the congregation can remove us.
Okay. Now, how does that differ? I think you're trying to make that distinction differ with other churches.
Yeah. So, we're actually pretty unique. Typically within your autonomous churches, whether it's in the Churches of Christ or the Southern Baptist churches, those autonomous churches lend themselves to domineering, authoritarian leadership. They're personality driven. So the pastor is, he's the man, he's the final authority. Then you have other churches that, they're kind of the opposite. They have the elders who are the final authority. Either way, I think those are both very dangerous ways to run a congregation, because it's not a biblical model. And I wrote a blog post on, submitting to your leaders is not as biblical as you think. And that article went wildly viral.
I'm sure it did because, excuse me, we've been taught, sadly,
absolutely,
that that's the proper way.
Yeah, and so what happens is you read that into the Bible because you've been told for so long that you need to submit to the authority of your leaders. You hear that so many times that you read that into Scripture. Well, guess what? It's not there. It's literally not there. It's not like we have to twist Scriptures. It's not there.
But I wish I could clear my throat here. Sorry about that. But it has through generations and generations been that way. You do have a distinction, and you especially see that. I'll use Catholicism for an example. Obviously, you have the Pope as the highest tier, and then you go on down, and you have
it's a hierarchical. It's built on the Roman government structure. That's why Roman Catholicism was built on. The leadership structure was built around the Roman government.
Right. And then that's filtered into all of the churches, whether we want to admit it or not. And you have, that you can almost see it. And that's why preachers or pastors, whatever you want to call them, have been put up higher. They've been put on a platform.
Well, they've put themselves there.
Right.
That's the problem. The problem is the congregation didn't elevate them to that position.
No,
they elevated themselves. Yeah. And, in fact, ironically, James McDonald at Harvest Bible Chapel was just fired today, officially. Julie Roy's put an article out, and she put a post about it and linked to the elder statement. And it's because there was audio of James McDonald in private conversations that was leaked to Mancal, who has a show. He was a member of Harvest Bible. He was baptized by James McDonald. He was good friends with him. And so James McDonald is in these audio clips, and he's just like making crude jokes and saying, like the editor of Christianity Today, he was calling him, I forget what his term was for him. Anyway, like he was calling him names, and he was laughing and like, I'm going to plant child porn on his computer. Then he said of Julie Roy's, who he sued. He sued Julie Roy's and the Elephant's Debt bloggers and their wives. He dropped the lawsuit, but it was a defamation lawsuit. So James McDonald, in these audio clips, is mentioning Julie Roy's, and he was saying that she's going to be riding a tricycle with a midget on her shoulders before too long. Oh yeah,
that's awful.
Oh yeah. Oh, there's a lot worse. There's 100 hours of audio, and just what Mancow released yesterday. The elders, all of a sudden, they're going to fire him. Well, they've known about James McDonald for a long time.
They've had to.
The guy just he berates people. He demands submission. He tells people to get in line or they're going to get run over. I mean, that's what he does. And so that's what these extremely conservative fundamentalist churches tend to go in that direction, because they're very legalistic. And, the leaders just, they demand that people submit to them. And it's a perfect, ripe environment for abuse of all kinds. And this report...
That's a mouthful, and I hope people grasp it. That's a really strong and good statement, Jimmy, that it's a ripe environment for abuse, and it is.
Well, we've created it. I mean, we've created a monster, and it's not just the autonomy of churches, because that's not what creates abuse. It's I think I've mentioned this before, but I've watched it's the show Seconds from Disaster, and they do like all kinds of different reports on accidents and big tragedies, but I watched all the series on plane crashes, where they go in and they investigate plane crashes and how they happened, why they happened. But in the introduction to that, they say, there is no one event that leads to an accident, but it's a series of successive events that creates this environment for an accident to happen. So it's mistake after mistake or mechanical failure that creates a chain of events combined with human error from pilots trying to correct, and, there's human error. It's a whole chain of events that happens within seconds of each other. Within the churches, it's not like people just wake up one day and they're like, oh, I'm going to start abusing, if it's a kid, if it's an adult, if it's domestic violence. They don't just wake up one day and they're like, oh, I'm going to abuse. Well, neither do churches wake up one day and say, well, we're going to turn a blind eye to this because, we're going to protect this guy and we're going to pass him from church to church. It's not like people just wake up one day and they make that decision. It's a chain of events, and it's this whole cultural environment that lends itself to abuse, but also to perpetual abuse, where we build the leaders up. We buy into this notion that because somebody says that they're a leader, you automatically have to bow down and submit to them.
And I
That's
think
garbage.
there is the idea too, you have to protect that person. Because
Sure.
they are
Because
the
they're a
leader.
man
They
of
are
God.
the-
Yeah, that's
the man
right.
of God. They are powerful. They are a man of the cloth. How many times I've heard that. As a preacher's wife, I used to hear about your dad. You know, people would almost get in a hushed tone when he was around, because when he walked through the door, there was the man of God. There was the you know, that person whose prayers were more powerful. I remember so many people saying, if I just had him to pray for me, he's got the prayers. It's kind of like he's got
I've heard all that stuff
connection.
before, and I just laugh because
that big connection. Well, but
it's so
innocently,
silly.
we think that way. And as a child, I can tell you, I was taught that by my parents.
Millions of people are taught that.
That preacher was special. He was a man, you know, selected and appointed by God. And that's how we feel, a lot of us. We've been brought up that way. And you're right. That creates that environment for abuse. So I appreciated what you said. Now, what's going on in the Southern Baptist churches is a whole big issue, which take it from there, Jimmy.
Well, I mean, you see in this report, it's
evolved over years and years.
And these guys, I mean, there were, I think the report said over 200
It did, yeah.
people that, I mean, these were verified. The investigative reporters checked them against court records. Many of these people had spent time in prison. They're on the sex offender registry. They had others who had very credible allegations where it was documented, or there had been successful lawsuits. So this is a whole gamut of different layers of verification and abuse and cover-ups, and a whole bunch of these guys were just passed from church to church. And so the theme within this 3-part series at the Houston Chronicle was there were many people who knew, and they did nothing. In fact, they either did nothing, or they told the victims that you're going to ruin this man of God's reputation if you speak up.
And that's where I kind of get it, how this all happened. And
if you understand that culture, you understand,
you do.
And how people are submissive to that.
Right.
Where I would come back and, you know, just being informed and really studying your scriptures, I call crap when I see it. So I'll come back and say, that's total nonsense, and here's why. And that's why I write my blog post about it. That's to empower people to come back to their leader and say, I'm not going to bow down to you.
So glad you are writing what you're writing and speaking what you're speaking. It's difficult for me yet to get out of my thinking the way I was taught. When I see a minister, a preacher, a person in a pulpit, automatically it's, you know, I was taught to show reverence to that person, to actually change my demeanor when I'm around that person, because that person is so strongly connected to God. And that's where I know. I have
a funny story, because this is fresh on my mind. Right. I got to tell you about this.
Okay.
This is okay, listeners. You're going to learn a different side of me again today,
Jimmy.
So, I was invited today to a pastor's appreciation lunch. So it was put on by our Christian school here in town, and there were a couple kids that go to this school that they personally invited me to come. So of course I couldn't turn it down. So I go, and we're sitting in this room of, they staged all of us ministers in this room before we went to the cafeteria to meet up with the kids. And so we're exchanging pleasantries, and I'm just kind of taking this all in and looking around, and people are introducing themselves.
I'm almost afraid to hear this.
They're introducing themselves as Pastor, I'm Pastor so-and-so. I'm like, yeah, I'm Jimmy.
Oh, boy.
Of course, I'm dressed down like I usually am, and I was definitely the least dressed there. And it's snowing and blowing, so of course I don't wear many clothes anyway out in the snow. But
did you have your bare feet and sandals?
No, I actually put shoes on this time. I shouldn't have. But we're kind of going around, and they I don't want to make it sound like they were all stoic, but they were definitely in their pastor persona. And I'm sitting there with these kids, and we're eating, and they're all having these like conversations with their kids at the table. I was making paper airplanes, telling them like these kids, because I can make this really cool paper airplane that's round. It's a circle airplane, and I've never seen anything like it, but it flies really good.
Wow.
So we're making paper airplanes and talking about how to write Bible verses on them, so if they get caught,
Jimmy, wow,
they can open them up and say, "Well, I was just passing Bible verses." So we're like I got permission to throw the paper airplanes, and we're just goofing off and having fun, and so our whole table was kind of laughing and goofing off, having fun. But I'm looking around and I'm like these guys, they're not. I wonder what they're really like in their own home, right. Because when they were there, it felt to me like they were being different, like they were acting like pastors, and I'm like goofing off and doing the same things that I do in my home.
You were Jimmy. You were Jimmy. You weren't pastor. You didn't.
Right. And I think that's what's happening in these churches. We've created this culture where...
And we have created it.
When people step...
the monster.
Sure. When people step over the threshold and all of a sudden now you're supposed to revere them and submit to them, and you can't question anything they say. There's a problem. That's abuse.
And it's both ways. It is, we have created the monster, and the monster, of course, has fallen into place. That's a place of power. And it can happen, and a person doesn't even realize it's happening.
Sure.
And then we're in dangerous straits.
So I think, one of the takeaways is, first of all, call into question when people are demanding that you submit to them, especially if they're making really bad decisions, and their comeback is, instead of, well, you know what, I want to listen. I want to learn more about why you were offended or why you're upset or whatever. If their comeback is, well, you need to submit to your leaders, that's a major red flag that
just
somebody's
attitude,
being spiritually abusive to you.
Right.
At the bare minimum, somebody's being spiritually abusive. So, my thing is, one, be empowered to really question that kind of authoritarian leadership. But two is, and one of the things that we've really noticed this past week is that the release of the Houston Chronicle article has really re-traumatized a lot of survivors, because it's reminding them that there are so many people who don't listen to them and who cover it up, who silence them, who tell them that their abuse doesn't matter. And so a lot of us advocates this week, and especially advocates who are survivors themselves, have been bombarded with survivors reaching out to them, just desperate for somebody to listen to them and validate them.
I think the key word is validation, and we know that survivors need validation. Mm-hmm. And when you hear these stories, such as this story that we're just talking about with the Southern Baptist churches, it's frightening, it's sad, it's terrifying, it's horrible, and it does, I think, stir up all of those feelings of abuse again within survivors, because that being pushed down, that's what abuse is. It is just belittling and smothering and chipping away at a person in so many different ways. And one of the hardest things is to know your voice didn't matter. And that's coming out in these chronicles, that, time and time again, that the abusers' voices were more important. That's the message that was being given to people.
Oh, absolutely.
Horrible.
Yeah. No,
Absolutely
I thought of this analogy too, because I speak at places, and the one area where I get the most resistance to, even in churches a lot of churches that are really doing a lot of things right, the one thing where I get resistance on is when I say somebody who's sexually abused a minor victim should never be around children again. That means sitting there in the worship service. Right. Never mind going to the children's wing. I'm not talking about going to the children's wing. I'm talking about, because what's the difference between the children's wing and the auditorium or the sanctuary where there are children? There is no difference. You're still around children.
You have taken a firm stand on that since day one.
Absolutely.
And I have been so thankful.
Absolutely.
About that.
But I get resistance from that because they say, well, that's not fair. And they come up with all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, show me biblically. Like, show me in the Bible anywhere where somebody's identified as a wolf who masquerades as a sheep in order to steal away the innocence of somebody else, where that person is embraced and accepted and given second chances and told to come in among the flock, and we're gonna embrace, we're gonna pray for you, we're gonna surround you and build you up. Show me anywhere.
And you're not saying that person isn't free to worship. What you're saying
just
is
not our own kids. Yeah, if they want to worship, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So,
but
and I thought about this too. Like, well, first of all, a good friend of mine, a reporter. We spent time with several families whose children are victims of the same abuser within a church. And they were, my friend is writing up the story, and I think he'll do a fantastic job. But when they were talking about the sentencing for this man who got away with this for decades, who had full cover of the church for decades, who still has the full support of the church, full support. They love this man. They love this guy's a child rapist.
It really blows me away.
Horrible. I heard the stories from the parents of what he did to those kids. So, the judge at the sentencing a couple weeks ago, one of the stipulations was he's under house arrest until they take him away to prison. He has to wear an ankle monitor. One of the stipulations that the judge put in was that he's not allowed to show up to church, because I guess he lives right at the end of church property.
Okay.
And so he said, you're not allowed to go to church. The parents all said, we erupted in applause.
I'm sure they
when
did.
The judge said that, because we've been fighting so hard to keep him away from church because he was re-traumatizing all of our kids.
It's
just by him being there, he was re-traumatizing them.
Well, of course.
So that's one of those things that there's such resistance to that. But I thought of this analogy: if somebody breaks into your home in the middle of the night, repeatedly, if they break into your home, okay, I'm a parent, my wife is a parent. If we woke up in the middle of the night to our kids screaming that there was somebody in their room violating their space, their trust, watching them sleep or trying to do things to them sexually in their sleep. If somebody was breaking into my home
and traumatizing
my kids in that manner and doing it over and over and over and over and over, the guy goes to prison, the guy gets out of prison. How in the world could I, as a human being, how could I say, yeah, we're gonna have this guy come around the kids and, I've heard stories.
Sit on the seat next to him.
No. This abuser,
it's just
like 3-4 weeks ago, when he was before his sentencing, when he was still going to church, he had a little kid sitting in his lap.
It just,
this is the kind of stuff
that is going on. It's happening. It's happening. Yeah.
And so I think the release of this Houston Chronicle article, excuse me, it's re-traumatized a lot of survivors because they're feeling alone all over again, and people aren't listening. So our message is, excuse me, you may feel alone, and it may feel like people aren't listening, but they are. And advocates especially people who are advocating for abuse victims, none of us are giving up. None of us are going away. None of us are shutting up. None of us are sitting on the sidelines. We're working really, really hard to continue this fight to change this rotten culture within a lot of these churches. And it's not all churches. There are some really, really good churches that get it right. Unfortunately, they don't get a lot of spotlight, but for the ones that are getting it wrong, we're going to keep fighting really hard to change that culture, and we're not giving up. We're not giving up.
I think that's so important for everybody to hear, Jimmy, because sometimes, you think, well, my voice didn't matter. It still doesn't matter. Look at all this mess, and it continues to go on. Yes and no. Mm-hmm. It's still going on, but it is at some point going to stop. Why? Because these voices that are being heard, that are out there, they are being heard. And it's like this big, huge tidal wave, I call it that again, that is happening. And when it sweeps over, believe me, it's going to scoop up all this dirty stuff and clean house. And it will
absolutely
happen. It will happen.
It's already happening.
It is.
So yeah, I think there's a momentum that's building. It's like a freight train. It's already moving, and it's gaining momentum. It's not losing it.
Yep.
And I think the culture within the church is going to be forced to change. There will be some that will willingly change. There really will. I don't want to make it sound like all the churches are bad, because they're not. But for the ones that aren't, for the ones that refuse and dig in their heels, and they're being so defiant, we're going to force change in them. Survivors they're not going away.
I love
they're not being silent.
That survivors are linking arms, hearts, mouths, hands, and are speaking out. And finally, the environment is the right temperature for them to be heard.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes. So we'll leave you with our truth bomb for today. Our truth bomb is, as alienated or alone as you may feel, know that in reality, there are many advocates and a growing number of advocates who are out there, and a growing number of survivors, dedicated survivors, who are not going away. They hear you. They're listening. They hear you. And we're taking action, and we're going to keep speaking up, and we are not giving up. We're not going anywhere. So be encouraged by that, and stay strong, and just know that you're loved, and we're going to keep loving you. We're going to keep listening, and change is going to continue to happen.
Amen.
All right. Until next episode, thanks for listening. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.